History of Mental Health by Juan Luis Cortez Cervantes. Lesson number 9. Mental Health in the Digital Age. From the year 2000 to the present. Towards the end of the 90s, mental health as a health policy was presented by international medical authorities as a problem without solution, an undefined objective that brings with it a growing demand to states with fewer and fewer resources, and without any concrete promise of relief or specific method. On the contrary, the increasingly frequent cases of violation of the human rights of patients and their families left the governments of the world facing an unparalleled social and economic problem, and a population with an increasing distrust of state methods. And without being able to point out any specific legal responsibility for the discrimination towards vulnerable communities for considering them mentally ill, or for the impact on generations of human beings medicated by a mania for seeing and finding diseases everywhere and at all times. It would seem that the World Health Organization would limit itself to continuing to try to make a box work like a wheel. The effort that inaugurates the emerging millennium is the report, Mental Health, New Understanding, New Hope, of the World Health Organization. Published in 2001, it was the first report dedicated entirely to the subject, and was used to invite the governments of the member countries of the United Nations to consider mental health as a universal health or comprehensive health priority. As a result of this effort based on the terrible conditions observed in the majority of psychiatric hospitals, and as evidence of the limited real impact of the Caracas Declaration that we saw in the previous lesson, various countries around the world are beginning to direct their respective institutional apparatuses to address the so-called mental health emergency in the world. The report points out the relationship between comorbidity, that is, how much of the population is affected, and health spending, which was clearly disproportionate, that is, many sick people and little investment on the part of the states. More than 40% of countries do not have a mental health policy, and in more than 30%, there is no program dedicated to it. More than 90% of countries lack a mental health policy that includes children and adolescents. See page 3 of the report. Making approximate calculations, if at that time 191 countries were part of the United Nations organization, and therefore 100% of their population was invited to take action, around 76 countries did not have a mental health care policy, which meant that approximately 115 countries had mental health policies. Then with the periodic publication, Mental Health Atlas, in its 2024 edition, the percentage of countries that have developed or updated their health policies approaches 72% of the member countries of the World Health Organization. See page 4 of Mental Health Atlas. That is, around 129 countries already had mental health policies for the year 2024. Now, why talk about percentages and not directly point out the countries where there is no regulation on mental health? Here we reach a painful point regarding the regulation represented by international organizations. On the one hand, both the United Nations and the World Health Organization see the tools for action as limited to recommendations. Let's say that these international organizations are recognized for their historical value as representatives of the superior values of humanity, but in real terms their value is rather sustained by the contributions and recognition of the countries that support them, both diplomatically and economically. For this example, let's name the states as working adults and the countries as their houses. It is as if the UN is a child supported by many adults who point to themselves as responsible adults for giving money to that child. And this relationship implies that from time to time the UN child points out what humanity in general needs, from his own perspective, and asks that the adults who support him change this or that thing in their respective homes, and of course he also asks them for money. But being a child, he has no power on his own. On the contrary, if one of the adults who financially support that child does not withdraw from the agreement with the other adults, the child simply loses political and economic power, without any consequences for those who leave the community of so-called responsible adult members of the UN. In real terms, the United Nations recommendations do not cancel or impede the sovereignty of each country, nor do they address the real social needs in the member countries. Likewise, the recommendations made by international organizations also do not respect the cultural identity of each country. Since the World Health Organization asks the member countries of the United Nations to attend to the mental health of their population, it is like asking an unknown person to invest in the stock market when we do not know if they have money to eat that day. From this perspective, mental health is more an argumental tool in the arsenal of the so-called needs that the World Health Organization points out as urgent in humanity. But due to the conditions surrounding its legal status, a recommendation from the World Health Organization is assumed to be the discourse of an international organization, without real power to define policies of sovereign countries, and without considering that carrying out this health policy is literally impossible, without trampling on the same individual and cultural identities inherent to each country that is a member of the UN. The following is a literal quote from the World Health Organization text. Mental health, New Understanding, New Hope, 5th page. From a cross-cultural perspective, it is almost impossible to reach an exhaustive definition of mental health. But for justifying its budget in an impossible proposal and announcing to all countries in the world their real inviolability, the efforts of the World Health Organization would go further, so that by 2008 the Mental Health Gap Action Program, or also called MHGAP, would be published. It was announced as the World Health Organization's most important operational strategy to universalize psychiatric care. In essence, with this program, the World Health Organization distributes a series of diagnostic criteria or observation manuals among the population, since according to its data, more than 45% of the world's population lives in a country where there is one psychiatrist for every 100,000 people. See MHGAP Intervention Guide, page 2. That is, the World Health Organization shares what was already written in public and specialized diagnostic manuals, but in another format. Let's make a contextual observation here. The medical profession achieved a certain organization so that there are two diagnostic manuals that dominate the legal, administrative, and health insurance fields. These are the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM for its acronym, and the International Classification of Diseases, or ICD. Both publications have a certain number of editions each, as the same administrative, political, and legal structure of society demands that they reformulate their propositions, as we saw in the previous lesson. But these are not the only diagnostic manuals. Only some other manuals and their corresponding source will be mentioned. CCMD, Chinese Classification of Mental Disorders, developed by the Chinese Society of Psychiatry. They are currently in their third revision. GLDP, Latin American Guide to Psychiatric Diagnosis, edited by the Association of Psychiatrists of Latin America, also called APAL. PDM, Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, originally published by International Psychoanalytic Coalitions. Its third edition was published in early 2026. OPD, Operationalized Psychodynamic Diagnosis, a manual of German origin widely used in Central Europe. Now, returning to the MHGAP, this tool appears at a very particular moment in history, since something was brewing since the 1980s, perhaps a little before. If we wanted to trace the origin of computer data management, it would be impossible not to mention the work of Alan Turing during World War II. Without going into details, we will limit ourselves to considering that in times of war it was very necessary to be able to communicate quickly and safely. That is, the enemies in the line of fire must not have the possibility of knowing what we were saying between us. And on the other hand, knowing what the enemies were saying gave us an invaluable strategic advantage on the war front. We went from the use and development of computing during World War II to talking about computers that weighed tons, rarities of some universities during the 60s, from the arms industry to academia to the general public. It was during the 80s when the technological advance that would shape the present time occurred in universities, the creation of the Internet. With the advent of mobile telephony, little by little everyone would be connected to the Internet most of the time. When the MHGAP was published in 2008, its free distribution eventually appeared as an application on mobile devices in 2017. Now, a free tool with global access that allows diagnosis and suggests treatments for different mental health ailments. It sounds quite good, but the content of the tool itself should be taken into account. Below are the so-called disclaimer sections, found in the introduction of the MHGAP manual. All reasonable precautions have been taken by the World Health Organization to verify the information contained in this publication. However, the published material is being distributed without warranty of any kind, either expressed or implied. The responsibility for the interpretation and use of the material lies with the reader. In no event shall the World Health Organization be liable for damages arising from its use. That is, as if the international health authorities were saying, I give you a manual and what you do with it is not my fault. Why such concern? One of the most important flaws in mental health logic and perhaps in the fundamental medical model is its conception of the relationship between doctor and patient. We have considered in the first lessons that all formation of values that the formation of groups entails is constituted as a form of morality. The value we are the good and they are the bad of the religious thought extends to what we do as well, our actions have always been good, or the foundation and extension of certain moral categories of certain groups as the basis of an identity at a certain moment in history. In the particular case of mental health, diagnosis as a medical process was indicated as good in itself, regardless of the group where such word is spoken or such category is used. Which is why the attempt to teach everyone what mental illness is thought by medical authorities as good in itself, and that is a mistake. It would appear that the medical authorities did not learn anything from the AIDS pandemic and the complications mental health brought to public health, which we addressed in the last lesson. One of the fundamental failures of the diagnostic process included in the MHGAP is that the diagnosis does not mean, for the human being in general, a problem that needs a solution, nor a clearly defined treatment, nor help to a person who does not recognize any problem, nor is it a basic improvement in the living conditions of the person who receives the diagnosis. Basically, what international medical authorities call mental illness is just an opinion, more submersed in a sea of opinions within social networks. An opinion that not only comes from organisms without any real power, but rather a false authority that appear to ignore their own history and the very logic of the human being. That being so, the logic of diagnosis as something good in itself obeys a moralization of the medical process and a logical failure in the construction of the semantic field of words. That is, doctors say one thing and want to give meaning to their words in a certain way, but such meaning is not the same even within the medical community. Either the doctors talk and each other understands their words as doctors, and to a certain point they can sometimes reach agreements, but the rest of the population can understand absolutely anything else from the words that doctors say and use. Typical interpretations include the meaning, I have an illness as if the listener hears, I'm cursed or I have a curse. Attributing a meaning or giving a meaning to some word is not an illness, nor is subjectivity a problem to correct. Although it is a challenge for the medical community to be able to understand that not everyone has to have the same values. On the other hand, the use of medical words in non-medical environments exposes subjects to burdens, destinies, or meanings that will never be the responsibility of the medical field and its professionals. Aspiring for mental health to mean to everyone what it means to doctors is like using a naked sword as a baton, hoping that we never cut ourselves or others with it. A logic or human dynamics that became evident with the appearance of social networks. These digital platforms bring together an unknown number of individuals on various topics and in various ways. By the year 2026, the publication date of this course, almost anyone and anywhere in the world can simply take their cell phone out of their pockets and record a video talking about any topic. That video is constituted as a digital space where other people anywhere in the world can see what has been recorded and comment directly to the creator of the video about what was recorded. This being the case, there is an almost infinite number of possibilities for knowledge and interaction at all times, on the more than 20 platforms that are popularly used to share content with the rest of the world. Within this universe of possibilities, of course, we talk about mental health, but not necessarily from the perspective and knowledge of doctors. Mental health, which began as a medical policy, would show up as a kind of psychoanalysis perverted by the American dream, bathed in the success that North American culture still desperately seeks. When social networks appeared, the demand for mental health and the fight against alleged prejudices against it extended to new generations of social network users as a kind of universal and human guarantee. For the youngest, not only mental health was a reality, even though the medical authorities cannot issue a single mental health certificate in any country in the world, but it was something that the youngest had every right to demand from the world. In this way, the youngest users of social networks demand the conditions that they identify to safeguard their mental health on every occasion possible. Thus, digital groups began to form in favor of mental health and were not necessarily linked to the medical approach. On social networks, the largest and most influential groups that promote mental health, but that openly reject and condemn the traditional medical approach, are grouped under the currents of contemporary anti-psychiatry. For example, mad activism or mad pride, and the psychiatry survivors movement, both with presences on social networks. Although the vast majority of these groups operate as a legitimate human rights movement that denounces real abuses such as over-medication or forced admission to psychiatric institutions. The algorithmic dynamics of platforms such as TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook groups have radicalized certain sectors. This has generated subcommunities with traits that are compared to sectarian dynamics governed by a strict narrative that we have addressed and explained previously. A narrative that is understood by the polarization of values or is summary in the phrase, "The external world or the doctor is bad, we are the good ones." In these and other examples, mental illness becomes a reason for pride and identity, and even a reason for rallying to defend one's own and others' rights. Or it may even become a struggle to defend one's own comforts, real or supposedly taken away by medical treatment, or also comforts taken away by all forms of authority. That is, by having formulated mental health as a value on which services were structured that never arrived. What was promised, political, state and medical power was naturally devaluated. In this digital world, comfort has become synonymous with mental health, and that is a completely logical construction of the new generations. Let's close this tour by mentioning a particular case that would highlight the severe limitations of the mental health model. In North American politics, the driving culture and maximum exponent of the ideal of mental health in the world, there were two cases of politicians with supposed mental health problems. The first was Joe Biden, who held the presidency between 2021 and 2025, being between 78 and 82 years old at that time. Biden was already a very elderly person, so his speeches with severe logical flaws did not surprise his listeners. Actually, his speeches did not lead to any severe conflict. They went down in political history as evidence of neuronal degeneration attributable to his age. However, the real case of diplomatic crisis came from his successor, President Donald Trump. We will not make a detailed list of his argumentative ramblings, but we will limit ourselves to pointing out an individual as powerful as contradictory, linked to Jeffrey Epstein and possibly responsible for sexual crimes, accused of one of the largest corruption cases in the history of the United States, releasing former Latin American presidents accused of drug trafficking and pardoning them, and then accusing other Latin American politicians of links to drug trafficking. Is he crazy? Not at all. Rather, he is an excellent example of normal politics. Even when the most powerful guy in the world starts talking things that no one really understands, even if he publishes images of himself as Jesus Christ, even when he fights with the Pope and calls him liberal, he still has support and followers. Facts that have led to the application of 3 cognitive tests at the time of writing this work. It is highlighted that cognitive tests evaluate signs of Alzheimer's, senile dementia, or cognitive impairment. Regarding this particular case, it is worth asking, is mental health a myth of the middle class? Could it be that the little interest in mental health around the world as an intangible good is due to the fact that no politician lives by those values? Or will it be the structural flaws in the approach that separate the vast majority of humanity from the psychiatric model? To close the course, let's analyze mental health as a psychic and cultural product.